Since Trump's election in early November, the price of Bitcoin has repeatedly hit new highs. On November 22nd, it climbed to a high of $98,000. It has increased more than 300-fold in 10 years. So the question is, behind Bitcoin's high price, where does its value come from? Or does it really have value? The total supply of Bitcoin is only 21 million, and nearly 20% of the total has been permanently lost. So many people believe that the scarcity brought by the limited total supply gives Bitcoin its value. But this is actually a misconception. Scarcity itself is not enough to give Bitcoin value. Just like not all rare minerals have collection value, and not all limited edition products will be bought by people. In my opinion, the value of Bitcoin comes from consensus. In plain terms, Bitcoin has value because people believe it has value. If I say this, some people will definitely think I'm being very abstract, so let me use a more familiar example to explain. Where do you think the value of the banknotes in your pocket lies? First, banknotes as currency have no intrinsic value because they are not backed by gold or other commodities. So how do we understand this intrinsic value? Here are a few examples. Gold has intrinsic value because it has many industrial uses, and many people also like to buy gold jewelry to adorn themselves. Oil has intrinsic value because it is an important resource for producing energy, plastics, and other materials. Although a banknote is essentially a piece of paper, it is backed by the national government and central bank. You trust that they can effectively formulate policies to manage fiat currency to avoid vicious inflation. And this trust has reached a consensus among the people of the country, including you, thus giving banknotes value. But once people lose this trust, the value of banknotes will collapse. For example, the currencies of Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Now let's understand my previous view on the value of Bitcoin. Although Bitcoin has no intrinsic value and is not backed by governments or central banks, its decentralized mechanism, meaning governments and central banks cannot control its issuance and transactions, is the key to giving it value. And Bitcoin uses blockchain technology to ensure that every transaction is public and verified and cannot be modified. You trust this decentralized feature and the public transparency of transaction records, and this trust has reached a consensus among global Bitcoin users, including you, which is what gives Bitcoin its value. And the larger the group that reaches this consensus, the higher the value of Bitcoin will be. So, the Yaifeis and Yanzus in front of the screen will ask, why are decentralization and public transaction records so important to Bitcoin users? First, we need to know that Bitcoin was proposed on October 31st, 2008 by a netizen named Satoshi Nakamoto through a published paper, and this was shortly after the outbreak of the financial crisis. During the crisis, many large institutions faced the risk of bankruptcy, forcing governments to implement large-scale bailouts, which exposed the drawbacks of centralized control by banks and the systemic risks of being an economic center. To cope with the crisis, central banks implemented quantitative easing policies, which means printing more money, and this has led to social concerns about inflation and the dilution of currency value. For example, if the total amount of currency in circulation is 10 million yuan, and you have 100,000 yuan, then you own 1% of the society's wealth. But because the government needed to solve the crisis, it printed another 10 million yuan, so your wealth was diluted to 0.5% of the entire society, thus affecting your interests. The general public discovered that the misconduct of banks could directly threaten the security of their savings and economic stability. The public also grew increasingly dissatisfied with the lack of transparency in money creation and its negative effects on the economy. The crisis caused many people to lose faith in governments and financial institutions, especially after seeing these institutions' failures ultimately bailed out with taxpayer money. And so, to solve these problems, Bitcoin was born. First, Bitcoin achieves decentralization through blockchain technology. No single entity, such as a bank or government, can control Bitcoin's issuance or transactions. This eliminates the reliance on banks found in the traditional financial system, reducing systemic risk. Furthermore, all Bitcoin transaction records are recorded on the blockchain, are publicly available, and the transaction data is immutable. This transparency solves the problem of distrust surrounding the flow of funds and money creation in the traditional financial system. Additionally, the total supply of Bitcoin is strictly limited to 21 million coins. This prevents the inflation caused by unlimited money printing. And when Satoshi Nakamoto designed Bitcoin, he also explicitly opposed the practice of governments and central banks diluting public wealth by printing more money. Finally, Bitcoin relies on a blockchain consensus mechanism. Any transaction requires verification from a majority of nodes on the network, which eliminates the possibility of a single entity altering transactions. So, you could say that the birth of Bitcoin was a product of its time. It was a response to the flaws of the traditional financial system, and even more, a challenge and an alternative to it.